Thank you. Cheers. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming back. Appreciate it. And it was disgusting, the horseradish. I didn't enjoy it at all. I don't know why people do that to food, to be honest with you. I'm the Director of Solution Architecture. This isn't thought leadership, really, so I apologise for that. This is really, I guess, a reflection of 2022, 2023, in terms of, I guess, that, all I do each day, every day is ultimately talk to customers like you, listen to your pains, and, ultimately, your business requirements, your functional requirements, your commercial challenges, and this is a sort of insight into some of the, I guess, success stories that we've had last year, and I want to share them with you, really. So, but just before I sort of delve into exposure management, I want to share a little personal one with you that I had the pleasure of receiving the other day. I was on holiday and I was checking my emails, cleansing my personal email subtle, when I got this little beauty in my inbox to say that, sorry, my data has been breached. And I think it's probably also common, really. Probably I wouldn't be surprised if there's many of you in this room that haven't seen a similar type of email that ultimately says that my data has been leaked again. And I think that I sort of laugh at a little bit of this in terms of it says there, what does it say? We recommend that you take the following steps which are considered best practice to keep your data safe. And I sort of laugh at that, really, because I feel like it's a little bit rich and a little bit too late to be giving me advice on what to do with my data now that it's in the dark web, essentially. And I also like this one. The good news is that as a result of my data being leaked, they're now offering me a free credit lock 24-month subscription. But I'm not sure if they checked the news back in 2008, I think it was. But I'm going to give that one a little bit of a miss. So thanks for that. But then I went to my safe space. I went to look at dash hands on Instagram to get back in my calm space. As my team know, I have my dash hand and I stroke it when I get stressed, and then I get hit with the no win, no fee Arnold Clark. Turns out the PPI guys have got nothing better to do now, so I'm now being harassed about have I been a customer of Arnold Clark within the last 6 years because I may be due compensation. I think that I think it's. I know what you're wondering. What car was I getting? That is it. It's not really. That's mine. That's the old boss's. It's Carl's just there. Yeah. So it's. I think in all seriousness, though, it just begs the question: is it acceptable that when we place our trust in buying products from consumers, from retailers, that put a lot of faith and trust in the product we're getting? It comes with service, it's in great standards, I get £5 of fuel and road tax and things like that, but there's sort of a back end neglect to look after the other things that we don't think about during that transaction. So I'm giving away my money, but I'm also giving away my PII as well. And I think that it's frustrating to be on the receiving end of that, especially as a guy that works in cyber. And what I can say in the conversations that we've had with customers and the breaches we've seen is that they aren't necessarily highly sophisticated. I think that Patrick's in the room, and if you've had a conversation with Patrick Ragg, our head of major incident response, while you've been here, they become sophisticated and persistent and annoying, but had the right things been put in place in the first place and the right configuration settings been put in place, perhaps we wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here with some. I wouldn't have anything to say, which is pretty unlikely, to be honest. But yeah. So, what was that breach? To be clear, I know nothing about the inner dealings. They are not a customer, nor will they ever be, because I've just put one up there, I think, on that. But was it through cyber negligence? Am I being unreasonable or harsh? I don't know, but I do have a right to be grumpy, and this is me speaking from a personal experience that I'm quite frustrated about my data being leaked and out there. But I think that if I put my cyber hat on, as someone that's worked with many clients, maturing the practices, pre, peri, post breach, I can make some fairly well-informed views on common gaps, and problems which might have left another retailer deep in the brown stuff. And whilst what I do know though is 500 gig, the acclaimed 500 gig of data exfiltrated doesn't walk out the door unless some form of controls are in place. So, what do we know about Play? Play claimed this one, but just before we talk about Play, what do we know about all adversaries? Well, it's in our experience and our knowledge of adversaries, they need to go through all stages of the kill chain, which is shown on the screen there. They have to, in order to get to their ultimate goal, which is probably exfiltrating data or encrypting devices, just causing general harm. They ultimately need to go through those stages of the kill chain. And what we know is that if we can thwart an attack at one of those stages in the kill chain, we can win that fight, which is great. But it's never a great strategy to just think, well, if we can put one layer of defence in place to catch these particular things, then we're good, right? I think that we need to be wary of those types of things and ultimately have a defence in depth strategy. Play themselves, they tend to gravitate more on vulnerabilities, exposed RDP servers, and one of the more recent ones was a 40 OS vulnerability, which they exploited. It's a pre-authentication vulnerability that allows a threat actor to read arbitrary files by sending specially crafted HTTP requests. Now, for that one, for the latter part, maybe not exposed RDP servers, but for the latter one, I have a little bit of sympathy for that, because security first vendors themselves realistically should have a responsibility to make sure these things are hardened in the first place, and I think that they should be held to account. However, I don't think there's a judicial system in the world that will be able to keep up with that influx of claims for exposed vulnerabilities. So I think it's a difficult it's a really difficult challenge, but so I do have a degree of sympathy for that. And the reality is, if a customer had been exploited by had known about the 40 OS vulnerability that Play in one of the scenarios would look to utilize, the reality is they may not have had time to patch that. They may have thought they've got other layers of defence in depth further down the chain that ultimately means that they're safe. So it's a difficult challenge, and I sort of do sympathise more to that side of things, because change control associated with patching can be quite rigorous and demanding. Does anyone know who this guy is? It's a guy called John Lambert, a guy that I think I've probably followed for the best part of my career. He's corporate vice president of Microsoft Security Research Center. Easy for me to say. And he said that defenders think in lists and attackers think in graphs, and as long as this is true, attackers win. In 2018, so quite a while ago, but I think that slowly we're keeping up. We're starting to catch on to this, and we're starting to think in this mentality. And that's, we're not talking about bar graphs or line graphs. We're talking about relationship graphs. How a adversary will use tactics, techniques, and procedures to pivot from one place to the next, carving their way through your environment like a knife through butter, ultimately to get to that end goal, which is your personal data. And what we're looking at there, that's what that is. That's the phases of players' sort of known tactics, techniques, and procedures that they utilise to get to that place, and that's ultimately the same type of map, just in a much more simple format, right? And I think that the laughable thing is that adversaries use tools. Look at network discovery, for example. Bloodhound, fantastic tool. Use it, Patrick. Yeah. Major incident response, digital forensics, they'll use these types of tools as well to sort of reverse engineer things. It's used for an adversary too. And I think actually it's a really interesting product. You can actually get a free version of it, can't you, to trial run and sample through your network. But these tools are available, and the point is that they use these tools to graph through our environment. And there's no doubt that we have made significant progress in thinking in that graph type mentality, in that graph type way, when it comes to, you've seen this slide earlier on Rich's presentation. Mine looks better. But no doubt significant inroads in regards to the advancement of SIEMs, the advancement of EDRs, the advancement of NDRs, and the pulling together of these things into a heuristic view through SAW, so that we can get that graph type view. And EDR is a great example of that. It pulls together a ton of telemetry, and it helps us to see in a graph type way what exactly has happened, what the relationship is from the point of entry right up to the point of potential exfiltration, obviously assuming it didn't get blocked in the first place. And make no bones about it though, EDR detects and blocks ransomware if it's configured correctly, and if it's also monitored so that we can contain things properly. So to the earlier question, I think it was from that side of the room, interestingly, and that's the funny thing is it does its job. It's great, but I say it thinks in a graph type way, thinks like the adversary, and it's an effective tool. But make no bones about it, despite us being Gartner Market Guide Managed Detection and Response recommended, that was a pun, and I actually swapped these around because you couldn't see that earlier. We got that in there. This is a reactive service. Something has happened, and we need to, we need to do something about it. And what we need to focus our attention on is how we start to evolve the exposure management phase, and start to think in a graph type way when it comes to exposure management. And I want to focus in a few of these. And I'll specifically around sort of attack paths and things like that. But this is the place that we need to get to a more proactive prevention model, meaning that yes, these tools should still be in place. I'm not for 1 minute saying you do not need these. It's absolutely critical, and the market demand and the requirement for managed services in this space has been at an all-time high. But this is the place that if we're more proactive and thinking differently in this space, we can get ahead of the game. What are the existing identify tools in our toolbox that we currently use? Well, vulnerability scanning. We use vulnerability scanning, but some of the issues of vulnerability scanning is that whilst it might be contextualized, it's not always easy to visualize. And the same can be sort of said for that CVSS versus actual risk. Something may look high as a CVSS, but there's nothing that's no remote code executable for that particular vulnerability. It's not externally facing. But it's a long list. Again, back to the John Lambert analogy. It's a list of things to do, and it causes huge patch and disruption and change control delays if we were to start to run through the hundreds of vulnerabilities in our organisation that we need to patch. So we need to think differently in that space. Pen testing, a great service, absolutely no doubt about it, because we provide it. But it's a point in time test, and again, it can lack context on critical assets as well. Now, one of the things that we're also seeing is with regards to penetration tests is that there seems to be a bit of a race to the bottom from a price perspective, and considered more a tick box type exercise. And what I'd say to our advice is that always look at the detailing in penetration testing, because if you're likely to be paying significantly cheaper for penetration testing, it's quite likely that they're jeopardising the scope, the depth of the penetration test that they're actually taking, potentially jeopardising experience or potentially jeopardising the methodology. So I would always recommend that you compare methodologies when looking at these types of things, because I think they are variable. And as I said, I believe that there's better ways. I'm not saying for 1 minute you do not do a pen test. You should still have human analytics, human views on penetration testing, but definitely look at the T's and C's within your penetration testing. But either way, it's also another list. It's another list of vulnerabilities and issues that we need to go on and focus on. Red Team, it's extremely valuable, no doubt about that. It's a fantastic service and conducted by highly capable, highly credible people. And but ultimately, we can't run Red Teams 365 days of the year, because that's going to take a big budget But what happens if what if there was another way to do a 365-day type of red team to give us that continuous view? Breach attack simulation, I think, is a bit newer. Biggest issues we've seen with breach attack simulation environments today is misconfigurations. Firstly, it's load generating, so it can cause outages. But misconfigurations can cause outages too, which actually are probably one of the same thing. And £5 to anyone that spots misconfiguration and misconfiguration there. That's intentional, not a spelling mistake like Lisa told me off for earlier. So, continuous exposure management. What is continuous? Well, why do we think that this has got traction? Why is it important? Back to my car analogy thing, really. There are movers and shakers in this area that will help us provide better visibility of external risk, internal paths to critical business assets or our crown jewels, but more importantly, consolidating these capabilities. Now, so Gartner says that by 2026, 70% of all functionality relating to cyber asset attack surface management, external attack surface management and digital risk protection services will be part of a broader pre-existing platform rather than provided by standalone vendors. And that's true. We're seeing that now. We're seeing the independent vendors start to consume other aspects to become an external and internal attack surface management tool, which is great for us, great for the managed security services providers, great for the businesses that are able to utilise these services. It's going to give us one big holistic view from external attack path right into internal attack path. So we're starting to see that merge, and what will probably, as Garner's referring to, it's obviously going to roll up into likely bigger vendors as well. By 2026, 20% of companies, I can't see that, I've put that sign in the wrong place, will have more than 95% visibility of all their assets, which will be prioritised by risk, control coverage, and by implementing a cyber attack surface management functionality, up from less than 1%. And I'm not sure what's more alarming about that. 1% at the moment have that sort of visibility. And again, I think that's a great news story, that we're starting to head in the right way, and that we're starting to recognise that there are different ways of doing things in this space. Hybrids aren't cheap, right? We know that. Sorry, not hybrids. That's a fully electric. I should caught in my own data there. Poor. Electric cars aren't cheap, right? But the reality is they're good investments, and I think that we need to find a way of justifying the return on investment for changing that approach and spending that identity space. And I read this document, this report. It aggregated 4 companies into a composite organisation, 15,000 devices, and mature SOC operations. I question that type of level of return on investment over that type of organisation, but fundamentally I think I agree with the principles behind it. Pen test, refocus and potential reduction in that space, labour cost reduction for prioritised patching versus a long list of patching, reduce business disruption, and not forgetting one that isn't necessarily easy to quantify, but the cost of a breach. If actually someone got in, so that's sort of not necessarily a tangible fund because it hasn't happened, but there's definitely savings and justifications for that. So I'll if anyone wants to see the report, I'll send them in that direction. So what are the sort of key characteristics? You'll hear a lot, and even I get confused, to be completely honest with you, when we're talking to customers or listening to vendors about attack path management, continuous exposure management, continuous threat management, trying to understand just how far certain vendors go in these spaces. But what are the key sort of makeup composite components that make up continuous exposure management? Well, it's the ability to detect hidden paths towards critical assets, which is technically sort of attack path management. Discover and prioritize CVs across on-prem and cloud, which is vulnerability prioritization really. Pinpoint gaps in security controls, continuous security monitoring. Find and fix Active Directory misconfiguration, so Active Directory security, and then detect misconfigurations and exposures across all clouds. That sounds pretty much what we need, right, in our lives. So how does it do that? So how do we prioritize remediation efforts on CVEs, on critical attack path, to identify critical attack paths and choke points? And I'll explain what a choke point is for any of you that haven't seen any of the vendors upstairs. I'll explain that in just a second. So the idea behind that sort of continuous monitoring is we have those thousands of CVEs. We have role-based vulnerability management, risk-based vulnerability management. We assess through AI predictions. These technologies assess through AI predictions the non-exploited ones in the wild, but equally don't disregard them. They ask the question about is it exploitable in your environment? Is it on an attack path to a critical asset? And are these CVEs? Is it on multiple attack paths creating a choke point? And what it also takes into consideration is credential misuse, misconfigurations, Active Directory misconfigurations, other compensating controls. And the idea is that it's constantly cycling that, and it'll give us the priorities of where to focus our attention. You may have seen this, and this is a without doubt the biggest success story. You may have seen this somewhere upstairs, and it's without doubt the biggest success story we've seen in 2022. And through the advancements of exposure management, attack path management tooling, it gives us that EDR view of the identity pillar. It pulls together the graph view of vulnerability scanning, the pen testing results, and really helps us to justify these types of tools essentially. So, how many of you will have a landscape which will look like this? Not the names don't have to be the same, but the principles are probably likely the same. SAP, a critical application, PCI, your personal data, the business's sensitive data area, and most likely, whilst we say AWS in here, most likely a multi-cloud, making this threat landscape a whole fold more complex and dynamic. But again, these are the types of things that are game changers in this space essentially. So what it helps attackers to see, what it helps customers to see, is all hidden attack paths leading to critical assets, the least number of actions for the biggest impact, as well as importantly quantifying the risk to the board to help justify these types of investments. And what we're seeing here is a play ransomware. Ultimately, it's not the exact play ransomware, but the same theory is these tools help to map the attack path through our environment, helping us to understand where we should be focusing attention. From a vulnerability, they've leveraged a stolen credential, an SSH credential reuse, stolen access key, SSM start session takeover, an S3 bucket write data, ultimately to get into the PCI environment. And that's a clear attack path there that's been shown. But if we just sort of take this upper level, if we disregard the arrows for a second, because that's really complicated to remove this on this slide, that's essentially a list of vulnerabilities. So we take that back, it's a big list of vulnerabilities, but bringing in attack path, it gives us that view, right? It gives us all of the misconfigurations, all of the potential vulnerabilities that can be leveraged in order to pivot around our network. But if we took a vulnerability management platform for as literal, it would be saying that this is a high severity vulnerability, and if we were to hypothetically follow vulnerability management platform's advice and patch that vulnerability, was that a vulnerability? Yeah, it was a vulnerability. Patch that vulnerability. It doesn't do an awful lot to the threat landscape. It still leaves us in the same position of lots of stuff going on, and a lot of alarming red in our key application areas and our personal identifiable information areas. When actually, the power of attack path is it actually helps us to understand where those crucial choke points are. In other words, something that will have the most impact to addressing the risk in our environment with the least effort. And here we've got a vulnerability in a data center and a misconfiguration, or assumed misconfiguration in AWS. So it helps us to visualize that. And if obviously we were to deal with and prioritize and put the change control in, and obviously this is a high criticality because it has onward impact, and we can describe that to the change control process. It goes into emergency change. We reconfigure we fix the misconfiguration. We patch the vulnerability in the data center. On those choke points, it leads us with a much reduced threat landscape, internal threat landscape, essentially. And look, there's still little bits on there that are red, but the reality is that that's real life. That's where we are today. There's always going to be vulnerabilities in an area in our environment, but it's important that we focus on where to prioritize those issues, where to prioritize our patching, essentially. But if we picture that in a proactive life cycle, so I said earlier about proactive prevention. Yeah, we've got our EDRs and our SIEMs feeding into SOARs, which trigger playbooks. If you picture this in a proactive life cycle, a change is made in AWS, attack path management, security score changes, and that ultimately not in a good way, in a bad way, and it triggers an alert into a SOAR platform, which ultimately triggers a playbook to initiate remediation. That could be a manual action to notify the stakeholders to obviously look at these misconfigurations. So SOAR has helped us turn an alert into some proactive actions that are hitting people's task lists through a service management or some function like that. But equally, we can also trigger queries into SIEMs and SOARs to proactively check for indicators of attack and indicators of compromise. So not only are we able to look at this from a vulnerability prioritization perspective, but it can also be used for that proactive prevention life cycle. That's going to help us stay much more ahead of it's going to help to pivot that issue from detection and response to proactive prevention. But let's not forget that threats begin externally. A lot of that was ultimately focused on internal, but that is absolutely where a lot of the focus needs to be refocused and look at things differently. How can we take the existing investments and do things more dynamically? But ultimately, your data is everywhere, your employees are everywhere, and your brand is everywhere. The companies are exposed to new digital risks every day. And it's a similar statistic, right? There should be a source for that. Apologies, but it's a phone mon. I think that particular statistic. But 71% of organisations do not have sufficient understanding of the attack surface, and that's absolutely still true. That is a year or so old, but it's still absolutely accurate because we're not monitoring our external footprint essentially. There it is. Sorry, is there? Phone mon. Thank you. So, why is it important? I feel like I'm missing a slide. Apologies. Why is it important? What should we be looking to monitor on the deep, dark, open web, closed group criminal forums? Well, it's. I feel like I have actually missed the slide. Apologies. We need to be looking at and monitoring things like domains, brands, IP ranges, document markings, VIPs, Twitter, social media handles of people that relate to our business, and we need to constantly be, ultimately we need to be constantly searching for our data out on the deep dark open web, and how it tends to work is that but ultimately there is quite a basic function of information gathering, which ultimately is input into these technology platforms, which helps to trawl for data out on deep dark open web and closed group spaces, presenting us with so it will continuously trawl for that data. It'll collect and analyze and contextualize, and again, contextualize is crucial because we see that threat actors aren't necessarily always using zero-day vulnerabilities. They're more likely quite often to be using, considered to be non-zero-day or maybe lower priority vulnerabilities. And what we need to be keeping an eye on is are there sort of toolkits out there that are helping adversaries to actually leverage these types of vulnerabilities? Because it could be that you see that there's CVEs in your environment that just has no relevance or importance, or it isn't actually been actively looked to be leveraged by an attacker. what it allows us to do is that consider again the playbook analogy really is that if we detect that leak credentials exist on deep dark open web and they relate to your business, of course during the initial sort of reporting phase you would tend to get a lot of information around that type of data, and you know, there may be credentials that have been out there for over a year old, and clearly, you know, the obvious logic would tell you that they've potentially been password reset or password changed, but actually quite often we'd be surprised that you know, some of those may actually be set to never expire, and God forbid that, you know, that's obviously terrifying thought, but it is real, you know. But equally, if we start to receive alerts for leak credentials within the last 30 days, again, this can help trigger playbooks into SOARs that can automatically help to trigger password resets to ultimately lock down these types of accounts. So it's one analogy in terms of why it's useful to monitor those types of external attack surfaces, as well as I say, keeping one eye on the vulnerabilities, not in terms of the severity of it, but more actively whether they're openly being looked to be exploited by threat actors. So, if I missed anything, and takedowns, of course. Takedowns are, you know, if we see spoof domains or phishing domains that relate to your business, it's important that we're able to see those and take those down quickly so that they don't have brand reputational damage. I normally have, traditional approach would normally be to give 6 bullet points of advice, but I've sort of cheated in terms of taking the take a graph based approach is me, but I think Gartner does it so well. You know, establish regular, repeatable cycles as part of your continuous threat exposure management program, guaranteeing a consistent threat exposure management outcomes. And the way in which we need to do that is by thinking differently at the tools and the investments that we make in that particular area. And this will help to pivot the issue from being more of a reactive based something that's happened in our environment to actually proactively preventing them in the first place. So look, that's actually me because I'm already at time, but I'd be glad to discuss any of these, and I can share some customer experiences with you about some of these success stories that we've had in internal and external attack surface monitoring. Thanks for your time. Cheers. Thanks.